Today we're going to be talking about gymnosperm life cycles, or conifer life cycles. As in the past, I like to start with the dominant stage. That's the stage you're most familiar with when you look at that plant. And that is going to be the sporophyte stage. So let's go ahead and start there. So I'm going to go write sporophyte on top. And then down below I'm going to write gametophyte. And the sporophyte is going to produce spores. And the gametophyte is going to produce gametes. Now we're going to add in some additional information here because I want to build this. I just don't want to memorize clockwise. I want to build a cycle here. So I'm going to do this in layers. So the next layer is to add some additional information here. We're going to make two different types of spores here. We're going to make a megaspore, which is the female spore. And we're going to make a microspore, which is the male spore. And we have two gametophytes, a female gametophyte and a male gametophyte. And the male gametophyte is also referred to as pollen, or a grain of pollen. And that male pollen grain is going to further develop and make two non-flagellated sperm. The female gametophyte is going to make eggs. Now let's go ahead and connect these up. The sporophyte is going to produce two different types of spores based on their size. Mega means large and micro means small. And we're going to call that process heterospory. So I'm going to write that up here, heterospory. And hetero means other or different. And we're going to produce two different size spores. Now this is going to be a little bit different than what happened with the mosses and the ferns, where we had homospory. Homo means same. They produce the same size spores. We're going to produce two different size spores here, and it's going to be obvious. So Megaspore and Microspore. The Megaspore is going to grow on the female cone. And the female cone is called the ovulate cone. It's another name for it. And the microspore is going to grow on the male cone, also known as the pollen cone. Now the megaspore is going to further develop and differentiate into the female gametophyte, and the microspore is going to again further develop and differentiate into a pollen grain. And these spores are going to stay put here. So spores stay put. Unlike the mosses and the ferns that release their spores into the air so that they could spread far away from the parent and not compete with it, these spores are actually going to stay put. They're not going to move. They're going to stay right on the cone where they're produced. And only later on will the pollen grain actually blow away in the wind. So our pollen grain is eventually going to produce two non-flagellated spores inside it. So if we draw a pollen grain, I'm going to draw one right down here. That's our pollen grain. Inside that pollen grain are going to be produced two, eventually anyhow, two non-flagellated sperm. So two non-flagellated sperm. And that's an evolutionary step forward, because with mosses and ferns we had flagellated sperm, and they had a flagella so they could swim through water, and we needed water in order to reproduce. Mosses and ferns need water in order to reproduce. Here we're freed from that constraint. These two non-flagellated sperm are actually going to blow through the air inside a pollen grain. So they're going to ride inside a pollen grain through the dry air. Now that allows us to do two things here. One, we don't need water to reproduce anymore. And two, we can blow a whole lot further away from the parent than we could swim with a flagella. sometimes even thousands of miles, so much, much further than we could go with just flagellated sperm. So that's going to be a step forward in evolution for these plants. And this, again, the pollen is going to be mostly wind pollinated. Wind pollination. And we're going to produce massive amounts of pollen, which is why sometimes people with allergies have problems with these conifers. They're going to produce massive amounts of pollen because 99.9% plus probably is not going to get to where it needs to go. And where does it need to go? It needs to go to a female cone and end up right next to an egg where fertilization can occur. But that's not going to happen most of the time. Most of the time it's going to land in the water, it's going to land on a rock, it's going to land on a tree, it's going to land on the back of a deer, it's going to land on you, it's going to land everywhere but where it needs to go. Only a very, very small percentage of that pollen is going to end up where it needs to go. And it's a numbers game. That's why we got to produce massive amounts of it. So that some of it will end up, by pure chance, where it needs to go. The female is going to produce eggs. Now, the non-flagellated sperm and the eggs are going to come together to produce the next generation, the sporophyte. But let me clarify this right here, because the way I drew this, it looks like these sperm are going to fertilize these eggs, and that's not the case because that would reduce genetic diversity. We want the sperm of another plant to fertilize the eggs of this plant, and vice versa. That way we maximize genetic diversity. And we want genetic diversity. That's going to be key because genetic diversity is going to allow this species to evolve. And the better it can evolve, the better it can keep up with a changing environment. And that's the goal here. That's the goal. Now, the next thing we want to do is write down our ploidy, the number of chromosomes. So the sporophyte is going to have 2 sets of chromosomes. So that's going to be 2n, and everybody else is going to be n. So we'll write that down. And now that we have that, we can figure out what process is going to get us from here to here, and from here to here, and so on. So how do I get from 2n to n? How do I reduce the number of chromosomes by 1/2? That process is going to be meiosis. How do I go from n to n? Mitosis. N to n, again, mitosis. And then n plus n to give me 2n, that's going to be fertilization. I'm going to call it a single fertilization event. That's what I'm going to write down. Single fertilization event. And what that means is one sperm fertilizes the egg, where another sperm dies. So it's winner take all here. The first sperm fertilizes the egg and gets to become the next generation, and the other sperm dies. Now it's going to be a little bit different when we talk about the angiosperms or the flowering plants. There, both sperm are going to play a role, but here it's just a little bit different. Now the final thing I want to talk about here is once fertilization does occur, we're going to have seed development. We're going to produce seeds. And seeds are only produced after a fertilization event. And a seed consists of 3 parts: an embryo, which is the baby sporophyte, a food source, and a seed coat. This is a protective covering. In the food source, seeds contain a food source. And again, that's an evolutionary advancement here because a spore does not contain a food source. But this does. So that gives this plant an advantage. It gives this embryo an advantage because it has a little bit of food to help it out for a short period of time. And any little bit of help matters. It's going to help that embryo reach maturity and reproduce. And that's going to be it for a gymnosperm life cycle.